he tends to he puts his foot down in a very strong way. Now let me tell you just a bit about some of the stories that we know about him. So Shimon ben Shaddach is known as, we actually have him over here in the Pirkei Avot as the second person in the Mishna. There was pairs, right? We go through 5 sets of pairs, 5 stories of pairs, and of those pairs, the last one is Shimon ben Shaddach. Sorry, these are the middle 3, but of the 2, usually the guy that comes second was second in command. However, when it comes to this pair, like you had Hillel and Shammai is going to come out. Hillel is mentioned first. We understand that Hillel was the main leader and Shammai was secondary, or the Av Bet Din. When it comes to Shimon ben Shaddach, there was a guy, Yehuda ben Tabai, he was mentioned first. So many people believe that even though the Yehuda ben Tabai was mentioned first, really Shimon ben Shaddach was the main leader of the people. Actually, there's a whole Gemara that goes into that. And based on the more history we know about him, he definitely seems like he was the main leader of the time. So let me give you a little bit of an understanding of what's going on at the time. We're talking about 2,100 years ago, toward the end of the Second Temple era. This is after the story of Hanukkah. As I mentioned, Matisyahu, who was the father of the brothers of the Maccabees, right? Matisyahu and Yehuda. Yehuda was the main of the Maccabees, and his father started it. Most of them died in the wars against the Greeks, because there were, even after the story of Hanukkah, there were still several more wars. The one of the remaining brothers, I think there was 2 that were remaining, but one of the remaining ones was Shimon. Shimon becomes the new leader of the Jewish people. He's a very pious and holy man. Then his son Yochanan Hyrcanus becomes the next leader, and following Yochanan Hyrcanus, who, according to most opinions, was a relatively pious man as well, but at the end of his life kind of strays away from the path. He has 2 sons. One of the sons is a relatively good guy, but not very well. He becomes the leader, but dies at a young age. And that son that becomes the new king, this is now the grandson of the first Maccabee king, he marries the sister of Shimon ben Shaddach, this man that we're going to be talking about. When he marries the sister of Shimon ben Shaddach, at that time he was still a righteous man, but his brother was not. And his brother was a really strong and mighty guy, but a little bit of a meshugana. His brother's name was Alexander Yanai. Okay. Now, as mentioned, the older brother who became the king initially and married the sister of the head rabbi was a relatively good guy. We don't think he was an amazing guy, but a relatively good guy. But the one thing is, he wasn't well. He wasn't healthy. And he dies at a young age. And when he dies from illness, his younger brother takes a ruthless, murderous, crazy meshugana. And his brother goes and marries his brother's sister, which is a law according to Jewish law. If you pass away without having any children, it does something called yibum, if she would like, if you would both, and they can have children in the name. So Alexander Yana, even though he's not a good guy, he goes to his sister-in-law and says, well, according to Torah law, you should marry me, and do you agree? Or some people say she's forced to do it, or whatever it is. Anyway, the fact is, she ends up marrying him. Now, she's a very pious lady, and she actually becomes the next leader of the Jewish people, as in queen. That next period is going to be a very, very peaceful period. According to many commentators, the 9 years that the sister of Shimon ben Shaddach, who was the wife of this ruthless king, that she rules, are known as the 9 most peaceful years. But unfortunately, that peace doesn't last, because her sons end up in a big fight, and something happens. But before she becomes queen, her husband now is Alexander Yana, who's this ruthless man, and he's now started to go and follow the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the people that did not believe in the oral Torah, and they had a big grudge against the rabbis. They thought the rabbis were responsible for all the problems, and they constantly there had one big agenda, which was to fight against the rabbis, the sages. That's where the Sadducees. So if their king if the king now becomes a follower of the Sadducees, that means trouble for the rabbis, because when you have the wrong guy in power, and if he doesn't like that rule, he's going to make trouble. So the story starts that once he was at a celebration meal for the king, and one of the Sadducees, hi Sherry, welcome. And I just saw that Mark joined, welcome. One of the Sadducees tells Alexander Yanai that he should put on the garb of the Kohen Gadol at this party. And he knew he did it because he wants to frustrate, even though he was kind of the Kohen Gadol, but there was a question mark on him, and they were busy doing some research into his background. So there was a whole bunch of issues, and they did it specifically to anger the rabbinate. And one of the rabbis questions whether he should be doing it, and as a result, Alexander Yanai gets really upset at the rabbis, exactly what the Sadducees wanted, and he kills hundreds of the senior rabbis of the time. One of the leading rabbi of the time, one of them was Shimon ben Shattach, his brother-in-law. And his wife, who is once again the sister of this great rabbi, was the wife of the king. She managed to save her brother and a few others that some managed to hide, and her brother she puts into hiding. Okay, so that's the more or less the story. Alexander Yanai ends up being one of the most awful kings in the Second Temple era. At one point, he got so angry. He did, while he was leading the temple services, he, instead of pouring water on Sukkot down the altar, he ends up pouring it on his feet. And the Jews get so upset because that was following Sadducee custom, that they didn't believe in the libations, they didn't believe in the oral Torah. And the water libations on Sukkot is a rabbinic, understood through the rabbis understanding the Torah. He didn't believe in that, of course. So people took their trogim and they pelted him. And in revenge, he killed 50,000 Jews. So he was quite a horrific man. And now you understand that, to go back a step, one of the things that Shimon ben Shattach had to do is he had to stand up to this man. He stood up to Alexander Yanai even before he went into hiding, even after he was hiding. Before he went into hiding, one of the stories that happened was, after he came out of hiding, the Sadducees, the people that did not believe in the oral Torah, had taken over the Sanhedrin, the high court of Judaism. And they had totally distorted it. But with the help of her brother, she managed, Shimon ben Shattach, the man that we're talking about, he managed to get position back onto the high court. And when he gets his position as the leader of the high court, there's still some rabbis, some are Pharisees, some are Sadducees, but people are extremely afraid of Alexander Yanai, of this king. Now what happens is, one of the king's servants goes and murders somebody. Now the rule according to Jewish law is that if your servant kills somebody, the owner of the servant has to come to court. So Alexander Yanai is brought to court. Now he's the king, or he's not an official king, but he's got the position of the king. And the rabbis are all like scared and giving him this honor. Now you're not supposed to give honor to a king in court. When it comes to court, everyone's supposed to be treated equally. So according to Jewish law, when anybody comes to court, they have to stand. And some of the other rabbis tell him, no, Shimon ben Shattach, they said, you go sit next to your brother-in-law. Shimon ben Shattach is, we're not going to have any of this. He says, no, this is not the law. This is an embarrassment. Even though he's in the ruling position, Jewish law says he has to stand. If he's been called to court, he's a litigant in the case, he has to stand. And Alexander Yanai says, the king says, okay, you want me to stand? I want all the other rabbis to tell me to stand. And they are extremely scared of him. They know that he's caused trouble to other people, and they are too afraid. And they do not ask him to stand. When this occurs, Shimon ben Shattach turns to his fellow colleagues on the courthouse, and he says that you're bent to the rule. You are not fit to be rabbis, and may God's wrath pour down on you. Something like that. He kind of gives them a curse, and they fall down dead, literally in front of him, his fellow colleague rabbis. As a result, it doesn't say that he cursed them that they should die, but he says that you're not living up to your job. You're bending to the authority. As I said, he was a man that never bent, Shimon ben Shattach. And when Alexander Yanai sees this, he becomes terribly afraid of Shimon ben Shattach, realizing that his brother-in-law is an extremely powerful man and he should not be messing with him. So he ends up giving him some more respect. But several things end up changing as a result. It starts to be the erosion of the power of the Sanhedrin, as in the power of the Sanhedrin is taken away because they realized that people were simply too scared to stand up to the king. People weren't respecting the rabbinate enough, and other problems caused eventually 2 generations later. Formally, they stopped capital punishments and things like that because simply it was not tenable anymore. Okay, so this is some of the scary parts about the history, the background. It's a very sad period, the period of Alexander Yanai. But Shimon ben Shattach is really the light in the time. He saves the day, and his sister, who was the wife of this terrible man. A couple more important elements about the story. What you're going to see, there's one of the most extreme cases that we have in Jewish history of court cases is that the punishment for witchcraft is death. According to the Torah, you're not allowed to be a witch. Magic, witchcraft is forbidden, black magic and things like that. Shimon ben Shattach, as the leader of the Sanhedrin, finds out that there are some 80 witches hiding out somewhere, and they're practicing real dark witchcraft. And he finds out, he gets all the details about them, and he puts them all up for one trial, and they all are found guilty, and they're all murdered all killed by the Sanhedrin on the same day. And that's considered one of the most extreme cases, because generally a court you wouldn't have a court killing somebody even once in 70 years. That's how rare it was for a court case, for a death penalty to happen. Here you had a man that put 80 people. Now, of course, this was considered a great achievement of his, really scaring people into practicing witchcraft, which is a tremendous danger to the people. But there was, of course, those people that were against it, and the relatives of these people. What they did is they brought up some false accusations and made false witnesses against Shimon ben Shattach's son, and such harsh accusations that he would have been liable for capital punishments. And they had all the witnesses and everything set up. And that's the story that's going to lead us into our story, into what he's teaching today. Because he knew that these people were false. Well, his son was actually convicted. He was not the dayan, the judge in that case, of course. But his son was convicted by these false cases, which they knew which he believed. I don't know what the conclusion of the case, if his son actually got the punishment, but definitely he was convicted. And that's why he says this statement that we're going to go into now.
Rabbi, can I clarify something? I've in parallel been looking just that Wikipedia has a bit of a summary with some of these things, and Wikipedia is often wrong, but it makes a statement in there that the witch hunt was 80 women in Ashkelon who were found guilty of practicing witchcraft. Now, I don't know if that matches the Talmudic version or not. But to me, it sounds a bit like Salem about the witch hunts there.
So I don't understand. What's the contradiction?
Well, usually, I imagine when people were investigated and found guilty, often it would be that men were perpetrators of whatever crime rather than women. But the witch hunt, the whole idea of, like, I haven't mentioned warlocks, which is the male version of a witch. but practice of witchcraft is forbidden to all genders, I imagine.
Right.
But to me, it just seems strange that it was 80 women only who were, 80 women specifically who were found guilty of witchcraft, and there were no men in that group of 80.
Yeah. Um, I think what is believed, and you'll see this throughout rabbinical texts and Tanakh, is that in those days it was far more prevalent for women to be um, witches and involved in witchcraft than men. That's what it seems from the historical text. We have a similar story in the time of Shaul. King Saul ends up also killing several people that are witches, and they're all believed to have been women, as far as I know. So I think that also um, we're going to have also in Pirkei Avot a situation where you have something that says Mar ben Noshim, Mar bo Zimo. One thing is that when you add in one thing, you're going to add in witchcraft. So it's understood. It was believed, and it could be that I don't know enough about it, but I think in those days, magic and those type of things was practiced, at least within Jewish circles, more by women than by other people.
Could well be, and it's possible that the text that we're about to look at may have the gender references there as well.
No, this is totally not about that.
Okay.
That was just a long preference in the more important the background, the historical background. I want to give you the story of Shimon ben Shattach because it's a very significant part of Jewish history, and it does that last story brings us into the story of Shimon ben Shattach's statement. So let's look at the statement. Shimon ben Shattach said, increasingly cross-examine the witnesses. Have a marbe lachkor es ha'edim. You have to ask as many questions to the witness as possible. We're going to discuss why. That's his first statement. His next statement is be very careful with your words. Shema mitoycham yilmedu l'shaker, because if you from your lest they learn how to lie from your words. In other words, if you're the judge on the case, is following on the previous commenter that also spoke about court cases. He was telling us how careful we have to be in cases of being the judge. That judges sometimes can give certain hints away or certain ideas away, and that can help the people lie or say things. So sometimes he's saying, going to just point out a few things. That is funny. I printed out my notes, and funnily enough, my notes from last week printed. Okay, so that means I need my other notes. All right, so let's look at this. Have a mar belach kares ha'edim. What does it mean increasingly cross-examine the witnesses? What does that mean? To really examine the witnesses. So here's the thing. We're told that in Jewish law, there's 7 types of major questions that every single witness in every case has to be asked. The number one is the time and how specific you are the time. So what was the exact date? So you want to ask the thing. You want to ask. You don't just say, okay, when did you come? Oh, it was last Thursday at the 20, at 8 o'clock. It's not the way it works. You want to try to find a way to ask as many questions as possible. So you'll say, okay, what year was it? It was 2020. What month was it? It was the 10th month. It was the month of October. What date of October? It was, let's say, it was the 22nd. What day of the week was it? What time of the day? Where was the sun? Where was the position? And you're going to ask all different ideas, and then you'll start talking about, okay, if it was at this time, this is what the position was. It was shady. It was cloudy. You want to know all about the weather, what type of circumstances. You want to try to ask as many questions as possible. Now you think, well, that's obvious. Of course, you're going to try to ask and get as many details. The idea is that the more questions you ask, the more chance you're going to have to slip them up. Why? Because according to Jewish law, it's harder to have false testimony. Why? Because you need to have 2 witnesses. There's no such, there is generally, we don't generally accept the full testimony on one witness. There are purposes to having one witness, but generally we can't use that testimony. It doesn't stand by itself. But two witnesses can stand by itself, which means that what you would do is they would separate the two witnesses. They would have them one separate from the other. They would interrogate the one, then they would interrogate the other guy separately where he couldn't hear what it's like playing, what was that game when you send the one person out of the room and you had to, the other person had to, say what the person's favorite food is and what the color of their toothbrush is. We used to play this in camp. Anyway, so they basically were sent into different rooms and they would be asked the questions. And if one of them was different to the other and they had a different answer, that's how you knew that they were lying or there was something wrong, right? So they had to have exactly the same testimony. So they would, if they were false, they would have to go through the details over and over again, trying to make sure that they're both on the same side. So the way you avoid them lying is by asking lots of questions and trying to trip them up. Now, of course, if they see that they trip them up and they have the slip of a tongue, that's different. But when you ask questions, the more questions you ask, the less they'll be able to be prepared. Not only that, sometimes they would ask the same question over again in different ways. And sometimes trying to confuse, because if the person had the story clear and straight, they would not get confused. And that's what's required to be considered good witnesses. There's another important thing over here. I'll just stop screaming. That, one second.
Rabbi, in that sentence we just looked at, I just saw maybe an alternative interpretation that in the mode of questioning, the phrasing of the question must not contain with it elements of the answer.
Yes, that's very true. That's one of the basic understandings of why you have to be careful that you don't lie. So be careful with your wording. Maybe they'll learn to lie based on your wording. So
that's called an open-ended question, Rabbi. That's part of the CSG train that when you question somebody coming to a shul, you don't say, have you come for the services? You say, why have you come?
Right.
Okay, so you've got to give an open-ended question, not a closed question.
100%. You see this a lot with all those type of Israeli-style security questions, like when you go to the airport.
Yeah.
They'll ask you, why are you coming? And you'll say, for family. Like, what school did you go to? And, what do you know about Judaism or whatever it is? And what are you doing here? So they don't ever help lead you on. Sometimes if they're trying to, they could... I suppose that's where they learn this concept from, being careful that when you cross-examine each witness, you don't lead anybody on to the right answers you're trying to get out from them. Okay, so that's more the clear and straightforward understanding of this Mishnah. The Rebbe takes this a step further, and he talks about that when you look at the name of this man, Shimon ben Shattach, you will see that Shimon means to listen, right? We know who was the first person to be called Shimon, the son of Yaakov, Shimon, that God listened to. Leah names him Shimon, that God listened, right? It means to listen. So he says when you are Shimon ben Shattach, means he talks about testimony. What's the main testimony, the main witness in all of history? We were the greatest witnesses in all of history. There was only one time that people en masse witnessed God speaking to human beings. When was that one period in time? That was
Har Sinai.
Har Sinai. So he says, over there we heard, your soul was the witness to that. Now you should take that testimony that you have, that you witnessed Mount Sinai. That's why we believe in the Torah, because we witnessed it. At least all our ancestors did, and so did our own souls witness Mount Sinai. Your testimony that you witnessed on Mount Sinai should not be taken for granted, and you should do shatach. What does shatach mean? His name, ben shatach. Shatach means to disperse. Spread it out, disperse it, analyze it, and really think of the heavy weight and significance of that testimony. This is the ultimate testimony. When you recognize the truth of the Torah and how heavy and how important it is, you will take it far more seriously. So he looked at it as the way that you analyze the story of Har Sinai, of the start of the Jewish nation. That testimony is significant. It's very significant. You know, many people have asked over the generations, what makes Judaism more authentic or provable than other religions? And that's the story of Mount Sinai, because we have actually witnesses. We had witnesses, not one person, not two people, but millions of people. When you take that message of the story of Mount Sinai, that we witnessed God and God gave us the Torah at that moment, we're supposed to internalize it. And that's the shetach. You disperse it throughout your body and you truly internalize it. I want to just conclude this discussion. It's a much more basic law. Before anybody else any other questions, with the short story of Shimon ben Shatach. He really struggled financially, even though his sister was the queen. As I mentioned, that was of no help to him, not because she didn't want to, simply because her husband was the king. And even prior to that, being one of the leading rabbis of the time, most of the rabbis nobody could afford to pay people to sit and study. Their students weren't able to afford to pay them, and most of them weren't willing to get paid to teach. So people had to work hard, and almost all the rabbis had another job. His job was, what he did is, he would go to the forest and he would collect chestnuts, and with those chestnuts he would make ink. But it would take him hours every day to do this work. And for him, it made him feel real bad that he had to spend so much time on his work and not being able to teach and study the Torah. And his students were well aware of this. And they convinced him, or they helped him get the money together to buy a donkey that would help him with the load and make the work take a little bit quicker. So he goes to an Arab marketplace and he buys a donkey. When he brings the donkey back to his students to look over, they find that around the neck of the donkey is a really precious and expensive jewel and diamond, whatever it was, but something worth a huge sum that would have made him wealthy for the rest of his life. And they run in to tell their rabbi, look, you don't have to worry about work anymore. Look what you've got this, it's yours. You bought the donkey, it's sold. And Shimon ben Shatach would not hear of it. He said, no, I would not sacrifice all my study that I can gain from being able to be taken care of financially to treat one person. And therefore he went and he himself took the donkey, or he sent it back to his Arab worker, to the Arab businessman. And the Arab businessman was so relieved, and he said he would go around telling all his Arab friends, blessed is the God of Shimon ben Shatach, because this man was willing to sacrifice everything in order to be honest and just. So it's just an interesting lesson you learn from Shimon ben Shatach. There's so much that one can learn from his life. He was a man that was willing to stand up to the authorities, not bend to anybody. But at the same time, he was not willing to, he was a very straight shooter. There was nothing crooked about him. Everything was to the letter of the law, and he saved many Jews at the same time, and he really fought for the Jewish people, but he was a very just and honest man. Okay, so that's our discussion for today. If anybody has any comments or questions, please feel free to ask. Thanks for joining.
Rabbi, could I ask you, was this at the time of the start of Christianity?
So based on my calculation, this would have been just prior to that. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, that within Jewish literature, there's two periods of time when Christianity would have started. So we spoke 2 weeks ago about a man by the name of Shimon ben Shattach, Yeshua ben Prachia. And Yeshua ben Prachia is the one person who is 2 generations prior to Shimon ben Shattach. And he, according to some commentaries, was the teacher of JC, okay, of what's known as Yoshka, the Mashiach, the leader of the Christian world. There's another story because the Torah refers to that man, which I said that week. His student that rebels against him, his name is Yeshua Notzri, and usually Yeshua Notzri is the man, the way that we refer to as the Christian Messiah. But there's another story in the Talmud which talks about JC, which seems to be more correctly referring to the real JC, and that is a later period in time, and that more fits with the story of the birth of his mother Miriam and how he was born. And we have, of course, a very different version of that story. It was not some type of miraculous birth, pregnancy. We have the very opposite type of story. But so what I would say is that it's probably, according to most historians, it's probably about 100 years before the birth of Christianity.
Yeah.
So could you conclude that, or make a train of thought, that the disunity within Jews would have resulted in a group of people coming up with a new religion?
Well, you're opening a real can of worms over there.
Shouldn't I ask it?
No, that's a good question.
Excellent.
It's 100% lack of Jewish unity is always the problem, but how are you going to convince the one side that they're not correct and they're not right? It's just one of the hardest debates. But with 100% lack of Jewish unity at crucial moments has caused all types of things. Although when it comes to Christianity, it's a whole different episode when you talk to the birth of Christianity. First of all, I would not say that Islam is really the birth of lack of Jewish unity. Christianity, you could possibly say that. Well, you mainly have a man that rebels against the community, and he starts a little cult, according to the Jewish version, and as a result, the person that really makes Christianity take off is Paul, who was a Jew. According to some opinions, he was a rabbi that was actually trying to move Christianity away from Judaism, because what you see about Paul is that he starts saying that you don't have to keep the Torah in order to be Jewish. So what Christianity had a big problem is that it was really the apostles that could turn Christianity into a religion. Jesus dies and there's not much of it afterwards. And it gets revived later on. The apostle starts to teach it, and the person that really takes it off, well, they're first trying to focus within Jewry. So they say, you've got to keep Judaism, but it just happens to be that Joshua is the Messiah or whatever, he's a prophet. He dies and it kind of dwindles away. And then people try to reignite it and give new birth to it. But what happens is they see that it's having an impact on the Jewish community. So according to some commentaries, actually the apostles were rabbis that decided to save the Jewish people by leaving in order to push Christianity away from Jewish practice. And if you move Christianity away from Jewish practice, Jewish people will realize that this cannot be the real thing. Now, these are all different versions of how it happened, but that's just a whole topic in and of itself.
Could I ask you, we are so clever, but we still have a lot of infighting. The Haredi, the liberals, Chabad, and you name it, so many streams. How come that we are not clever enough to find a common ground?
I want to say something really important you said over there. I don't think there's anything wrong with having different streams. There's nothing wrong with having different streams. different streams is healthy. You know, we don't want to have university. It's never been a Jewish thing that everything uniformity. Sorry, that everybody is just universally following the same, the same path. People have to have their path within the context of Judaism. That was always fine. Different customs, as long as Ashkenazim, Sephardim, all that stuff. There's no reason for infight within them. But what is a problem is when people try to take a Torah and make, turn it upside down or discredit it or things like that, which is a fundamental belief. So within the Orthodox world, I don't think there's a problem with all these different factions within Orthodoxy, Chabad and Ashkenaz and Sephardi. In general, I think today's day and age, we more or less all get along. We just have slightly different approaches to Judaism, but we're all more or less getting along. And we should not be fighting 100%. When you talk about other groups that claim to be Jewish by doing Jewish culture, that's a whole topic in and of itself. That is questionable, whether if you have a group that believes in the Torah and then suddenly we only believe in this concept or we believe in that concept, and they start saying, well, we're going to be Jewish because we like the concept of Pesach, but you don't really have to eat matzah, you don't really have to eat the Nusach Chametz. So when people start saying, and they still want to call themselves Jewish, then it's up to us to say, well, is this Judaism or not? And therefore, if you're having there was recently a Black Lives Matter protest in America, and some Jewish religious guys wearing kippot were there protesting with the Black Lives Matter people. And somebody came up to them and it was on film. One of these African American guys came and said, "What? This is not your fight. Get away. You're not the real Jews. We the real Jews." Now, that's all coming. If anybody wants to come to be Jewish, that's good and fine. Whatever. But don't make it my problem that somebody else wants to become Jewish. And the same thing is, like, many people are Jews, but not necessarily it's a Judaism. So I think it's really important to differentiate between disagreements within Judaism as opposed to people coming and claiming to be Jewish but detracting from Judaism. So it's a very important differentiation. I think there's only one Judaism, that's the Torah, God given to us, etc. Other paths, I don't think it's really fair to call them necessarily Judaism, although the people that do this are very much Jews sometimes.
Rabbi, may I add the experience during the lockdown and Yom Tovim and the challenge that was presented with attending shul remotely via Zoom. As you know, Kehilat Nitzan, a conservative Masorti shul, they elected to stream their services. Most Orthodox shuls did not. Now, my interpretation of that and responding to Fritz is that there's an example where it could have been a very divisive issue causing riots and all sorts of stuff. It actually didn't. In the end, Judaism is democratic and each of us decides for ourselves how we want to participate. And so the Orthodox stated their position that streaming is not allowed for Yom Tov. Conservative Masorti stated their position that they have examined the halakha and they decided it's okay. But they didn't. But neither group forced anyone to choose what they would participate in. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, although I disagree on the premise of it. Although I'll talk about your point. Fritz, just in conclusion with your point, in that I agree with you that we do have to have more unity. Although I think that often people look at different customs within Orthodox Judaism as a problem, and that's where I don't think that there is a problem. There definitely is a problem of bad mouthing different groups and different customs and people. Chabad and Chabad, we definitely shouldn't be doing it because this was one of the foremost teachings of our rebbes, of our leaders. So from Chabad, it's definitely not acceptable. It's not acceptable from any Jew because one of the major principles of Judaism is to love your fellow as yourself. And that applies whether the person is a religious practicing Jew or not. But different custom, I don't think is a problem. It's always been an accepted thing all the way back to the tribes. There was different customs for different tribes. That's okay. And we do need more unity. I agree with you 100%, and hopefully we should. But it doesn't have to become at the expense of different opinion. Judaism was always pro different ways of looking at things, as long as it was within the context of halacha. And that's where I'd say, to Joe's point, that it's all good and fine to come and say that we found a way that you can do Zoom. Well, let's make sure that we're doing it based on authentic halacha. I happen to see the conclusion of that about using Zoom, and I could tell you that they try to base it on Zalman, on one of the great authorities in Israel of the last generation, probably the greatest authority on understanding of halacha and electronics. And he was, his name is, I can't believe it, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and they try to quote him, and they totally 100% misrepresented everything that he said. And there was lots of articles just proving that. So people try to use things, and that's when it's problematic. It's one thing if you want to try to use people. It's okay if you, and there were Orthodox rabbis that tried to use, and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was an authority. If you have an authority and you could actually prove it, that's fine. But don't take an authority and totally distort it, which is what we've done in that case.
Rabbi.
So, but
Rabbi.
that doesn't mean that I'm against it. I'm just saying that it has to be within the work frame of halacha.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Dare I say it, that it's your background that is causing you to say that it's been completely misinterpreted. I'm sure the people that interpreted it that way will say that they've interpreted it correctly. And this is humankind. This is the Republicans versus the Democrats all over again.
Mark, I disagree with you. I'll tell you what. Okay, I don't want to really get into a debate about this, but I'll tell you what. If they could find one person that clearly understood Shlomo Zalman Auerbach the way, it wasn't that he was different understood. It's that they actually took a part of the text. They took the part of the text, cut it out, and never used the full context. And therefore, when they brought it up to all rabbis within the main law, the leading rabbis, no one could find any legality for it. There was no legality for it. But they tried to base it on, by cutting it, what the difference was what they were trying to do. And I understand what they were trying to do. They were trying to find a way to make it happen, which is fine. That's good. I don't mind people trying to do that. What I mind is when people try to say, look, I've got this authority to backing me. And then they distort that authority. And as soon as somebody went and opened the entire letter written from him, the conclusion was 100% different. And there was nobody that argued with it, anybody that presented the entire case.
Okay, I'm prepared to accept that.
There was many rabbis that went and revisited exactly what they're saying and disproved it. So it wasn't anything that it was my teachings. If you want to go and you want to say, based on your statement, Mark, exactly using your words, it's my teachings that's making me say that. It's Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's teachings of understanding yeshiva, which is the same style as my teachings, which allows you to understand the Torah. If you haven't been to the yeshiva for several years and understood the way halacha works, and you want to come and cut a pace, you may not get to think, but you then don't rely on that type of teaching. So I understand it's a very contentious issue. And I have no problem with people that wanted to use Zoom. I understand the circumstances. I understand the people that are trying to justify it. But what I didn't like about it, and this was just a slight thing, and I don't really want to get into this because I understand I don't want it to be a turn off to anybody, 100%. And anybody that finds some justification, fine. What I don't like about it is that they took a concept and they tried to say, look, I've got this rabbi, and he lived 30 years ago, and we got a context from him, and look, we can prove our case. But we can't find any real rabbi that is authoritative today that will agree with us. But look at this little piece over here, agrees, and therefore they put it up on their boards, and they said, look, this man was a chazan once in an Orthodox shul, he must be Orthodox, and then people that were innocently joined. Do you understand what I'm saying? And that was my problem. If you want to stand up and say, look, we feel that the circumstances require this, and therefore it's the right thing to do, fine. I have no problem with that. But when you're going to start twisting text and start making look like this is mainstream orthodoxy, that's what I have a problem with.
Okay.
Okay.
Of course, any reasonable person would agree with that.
Okay. And that was the main problem that we have, is that they try to make it look as though it was mainstream orthodoxy, where they couldn't find a single mainstream Orthodox rabbi to find any way to agree with them.
So that's misrepresentation straight out.
100%. It was straight up misrepresentation.
Yeah, but if a conservative Masorti rabbi issued a ruling under his own name, saying my interpretation,
that's fine. That's fine. We could say that we can go and we could have a debate with them and why we think that their understanding is wrong. That's okay. Fine. But don't call it orthodox.
Yeah.
And then his followers will say, well, he's our rabbi, I'll follow them. And the people that want to follow orthodoxy will follow the Orthodox rabbi. But don't put the Orthodox stempel on it. Do you understand?
Yep. It's kashrut in a different way.
That's my point. Exactly. Don't put the Orthodox stempel on it. That I feel was very misleading about the whole thing. Okay?
Shkoyach. Good answer.
All right. Anyway, it's always opening can of worms over here. Thanks everyone for joining. I appreciate it. I hope I didn't turn anybody too much off, but
not at all.
Have a good day.
It's always good to have an opinion and to stand for it. I like that.
And don't be turned off if I disagree, please. It's I'm just trying to be like Shimon ben Shutta and stand up for a little bit of truth.
That's my religion.
Okay. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Rabbi Mendel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.